So thank you, Kodo, so much for your kind introduction. And also, I just a minute, I got to get this off my screen here. I want to thank Roshi Joan for inviting me to have some time with this wonderful and inspiring Sangha. And I have to say that as I try to keep up with all the diverse offerings and the programs and the ways that Upaya has of reaching out and helping our world in very significant ways, I'm not only inspired and amazed by it, and I am amazed by it, but sitting on the island where I live in British Columbia with my family, I am truly often in awe of what you do. So I'm glad to have this opportunity to thank you all so much in person, or well, sort of in person, in Zoom person, for living our vows in the important and the beautiful ways that you do. In planning this talk, we thought it would be a good opportunity for me to introduce the three Taoist women poets that Rebecca Nie and I translated for our book, Yin Mountain, the Immortal Poetry of Three Taoist Women, which came out at the end of 2022, and for which Roshi Joan was kind enough to write a very generous endorsement. So I want to thank Roshi Joan for that too. We worked on this book for 3 years. And it was pretty much my sanctuary. Doing the work for this book was my place of refuge during the long and very challenging and very difficult COVID years. And every morning I would wake up, I would practice, I would get something to eat, and I would go down to my studio, and then I would find myself transported into the 8th and 9th century in Tang Dynasty, China. Tang Dynasty is roughly, from, let's say 700 to 900 or so. That's a kind of rough estimate for it. And that's where these poets and their poems were waiting for me. And I was absolutely transported by the work. I've never just sort of slid just into a stream quite as naturally as I did in working with these Taoist women. Some of you may know that the Tang Dynasty in China is considered by many the golden age of Chinese poetry. And many of the poets, male poets from that period were active then. Poets whose names you might know, like Wang Wei and Li Bo, Du Fu, and Han Shan that Kodo mentioned, that Kaz Tanahashi and I translated. And they're quite well known in English. They've been translated a number of times. But precious little poetry by the women poets is known. So Rebecca and I were really excited to do this work and to think that in a very modest way, of course, really a drop in the bucket, but every drop that goes into the bucket helps to fill the bucket. Know that our work would partially address, and in some small way, offer some kind of remediation for this serious historical blindness that has kept us from knowing our female poets from this great and golden age period of the Tang Dynasty. So I thought I'd start this talk by spending a few minutes just giving you a little bit of context so that you could get a sense of the world that these poets were living in and writing in. All three of our poets, their names were Li, Yu Xuanji, and Xue Tao, were Daoist priestesses and practitioners. And as we discovered, their lives and their poetry was also highly influenced by a very active and alive goddess culture that existed in China at the time. We didn't know anything about this when we started to translate it, but the more we did our research and went into it, the more really stunned we were at how profound and pervasive the intertwining of Taoism and goddess culture and their personal lives were, and how brilliantly, really, the poetry that they wrote wove together the myths and the legends and the traditions of goddess culture that were relevant to Taoist culture and to Chinese culture in the Tang Dynasty at the time. But they also did this in a way that gave real living voice to their daily lives as women. Poems of love, poems of loss, poems of their struggle, as women in a society that was still governed by a patriarchal and misogynistic controlling society, which means that these women poets struggled in ways that are not so different from the ways that women around the world sadly continue to struggle today. But at the time, and this is very important, we didn't know anything about this. At the time, Taoist priestesses were also considered demigoddesses. And our poets fully embraced this understanding of their lives as what might be called Taoist goddess women. For example, they often relied on the legend and the spirits of one of the goddesses, known as the goddess of erotic passion and intimate affairs, who was said to reside in the clouds over Wu Mountain. And this came about because it is said that there was a young woman, probably a teenager, who was the daughter of the mythological founder of agriculture in Chinese culture. And she was a very alive, very vivid, a very active, a very imaginative, a very adventurous young woman. And one day she went swimming in the waters below Wu Mountain and she drowned. The story about her, I can't remember her name right now, but the story about this young woman is that she then reincarnated and floated up and became some of the clouds and rain and mist that drifted above Wu Mountain. And being the incarnation as clouds and rain and mist of this young adventurous woman, the legend is that from time to time when she would be hanging around over the mountain, she would spy down and see someone hiking in the mountains there. And if she found them appealing, she would incarnate again as a young human female and go down and meet them. And pretty soon a seduction would take place and they would have a lover's tryst, and then they would go on their way and she would float back up over the mountains. And when Rebecca and I found this legend about her, we laughed and said it probably increased people's interest in hiking on Wu Mountain when this was found out. But it's important also because in Chinese poetry, the phrase clouds and rain and mist and other water features or water elements are symbols for lovemaking in Chinese poetry. As I have thought about this and as I see it, locating this mysterious and unsayable Tao. Tao means way, and I say that it's unsayable because in the Tao Te Ching itself it says the way that can be expressed is not the eternal way. So they say it's unsayable, and also in the Tao it says that it's mysterious. But locating it in a woman's sensuality, and these poets considered the Tao their original home. They say so in some of the poems that we have translated. But locating a woman's sensuality in the Tao was a powerful statement of the Taoist understanding at the time, that among other essential attributes associated with the Taoist female principle known as Yin. So the Taoist female principle is Yin, the Taoist masculine principle is Yang. We've all heard of Yin and Yang. But that's what those words refer to. And some of these attributes included receptivity, the fertility of the dark, which isn't just the darkness of the soil out of which plants grow, but also I take it as the dark of the human mind and imagination, the deep mind, one might say, that includes the imagination and intuition, and all of those elements that are not ineffable and not really easily seen. Some of the elements also include moisture. They include fluidity, highly valued in Taoism, flexibility as well, plus the entire intelligent realm of the internal world of human beings and all aspects of nature. In that context, a woman's passion and sensual nature were clearly understood as the rightful embodiment of the Tao in human female form. This is no small thing. This means that human female form is an embodiment of the entirety of the Tao, according to Taoist understanding at the time. And as such, the yin female principle was praised as the source of life itself. This is right there in the 6th chapter of the Tao Te Ching, in the opening lines of that chapter, and I translated them for you so you could hear what it is that I'm talking about. The phrase in the first line is valley spirit. And if you think for a moment about a valley spirit, it's a natural image of the female principle of yin. The valley spirit never dies. It is called the mysterious female. The gateway of this mysterious female is the source of heaven and earth. I really think it's quite wonderful, because it's my sense that this can be seen as directly pointing to what in Buddhism is known as the Tathagata Garpa, the Buddha womb, or the womb of the Buddha, the unconditioned, boundless, nurturing, sustaining, and deathless womb out of which the Buddha, and when I say the Buddha, I mean all Buddhas, which includes everybody here today, arises. There's a lot more that I could say. I'm not going to now because of time limitations. It's in the book, as they say. But let me just say, before introducing the first poet, Li Ye, that despite the limitations and the subjugations that they had to deal with, female poets and Taoist priestesses and female Taoist practitioners also enjoyed certain benefits of living at that time in a cosmopolitan empire. And that time period was very unique for many Chinese women. Things weren't so good shortly after, when the Confucian orthodoxy really took control and kind of tried to stomp down everything that they could that had been allowed during the Tang Dynasty. But women in the Tang Dynasty were free to divorce husbands. They were free to remarry. They were free not to marry at all. They didn't have to marry. They were free to take lovers, for example, to have multiple partners. This is a kind of freedom that these women enjoyed themselves, the 3 women poets that I'm talking about. Women at the time had a certain amount of access to education, so they could study poetry and write poetry, for example. And they were able to leave their marks on fields that were traditionally reserved for men in the culture, which I find pretty interesting. I don't want to overplay it, because it is true that the society was far from equitable between the sexes, but these freedoms and these rights and these abilities basically did exist. As we translated the poets, Rebecca and I should say their work was well known in their time period, which is pretty remarkable. They had the ability to consort, to communicate, and to correspond with male intellectuals and other poets and artists that were writing in the day, and their reputations were pretty good in terms of being known during this period when they were actually writing. And when you think about that, that's extraordinary. But something else that I find really extraordinary is that we have their poems now. These poems have lasted, they've been saved, they've been preserved for 1,300 years, which is nothing that we can say about our culture and our language. We're so young by comparison. But as we translated their work, there was one other unifying factor that we found. This was very, very clear to Rebecca and myself, and that was the independent, uncompromising voices that appear in their poetry, that really reverberates in their work. They had a real refusal to hold back from saying what they felt needed to be said about their lives as women, no matter what realm of their life it addressed. And despite all the social signals and all the social controls that tried to sometimes keep such expression in check. And so when I think about their poetry, at least for myself, I find them I find them to be early feminists in the history of human consciousness, which was quite a discovery, I have to say. Where's the book? Here's the book. Let me start with Ye, the first poet. She was considered. First, I have to get to her page. Yeah, she was considered a poetry hero at the time amongst the women poets, and she was a very interesting, very inventive person. She was known for her poetry. She was known for her calligraphy. She was known for her musical compositions. She was highly regarded as a Daoist priestess. And Li ended up having a story that has quite a tragic ending, which I'm going to tell you in a moment. There's a charming story about her when she was 5 years old. It's said that she spontaneously wrote a poem about roses and brought it to her father, who had a guest visiting, and she recited the poem to her father and his guest, and they apparently nodded approval, said that's very nice, and she went off on her way, as a 5-year-old will do. And apparently the father then turned to the guest and said, for his daughter to marry when she's older would be a waste of her potential. If you think about a father saying that in the 8th century in China, it's really a remarkable thing to imagine. She had relationships with some of the seminal people in China at the time. Supposedly, she had an affair with Lu Yu, who's credited with, who's known as the Sage of Tea, credited with starting the tea ceremony in China in the 8th century, also with some of the other male poets. And her reputation was so strong that in her 50s, when she was already ensconced in a Taoist convent living there, the emperor heard about her, and he summoned her to leave her sanctuary and come to the palace and to teach the women there. And the women meant the women who were part of the palace culture, but it also including his harem. And Li referred to them as fragrant grasses. Unfortunately, during that first year that she was there was a rebellion in China against the emperor, and Li went into hiding. She was quite frightened, but she was captured by the rebels. And while in captivity, she was forced to write poems in support of the rebellion and in support of the leader of the rebels. The emperor's army put the rebellion down eventually. And when her poetry was brought to his attention, despite an outcry against this, he said that she had been a conspirator and she was not the woman he thought she was, that she had been a conspirator with the rebels. And so he had her executed, which is a pretty terrible ending for this woman. The first poem of hers that I'm going to read is called Accidental Abiding. And those of you who meditate know that you've probably heard the phrase that enlightenment is an accident. It may be an accident that is nurtured along the way, but there's a sense that you can't just decide I'm going to be enlightened and then you do that. There's something about it that has to do with our practice, and in this poem, she gives you that sense of that accidental abiding in a certain state of mind. And then she takes the poem in another direction, which I think all meditators will understand. My mind is a distant drifting cloud. I know it won't return. It lives with clouds in the space between existing and the void. Why do gusting winds scatter it about, blowing back and forth from the southern to the northern mountains? So that those first few lines, my mind is a distant drifting cloud that lives with clouds in the space between existing and the void. This could be a kind of form and emptiness understanding. She could be sitting samadhi, for example, but then sure enough, Gusting winds scatter her mind about, and she asks an important question. Why does that happen? Why do they blow it back and forth from the southern to the northern mountains? I think it's a good question for meditators to ask. Why does the mind do that? Why does it want to do that? This next poem addresses Wu Mountain and addresses her life as a fully sensual being and as a goddess. And she clearly fully embraces her sexuality in expressing it in this poem. And it's found in the rhythms and some of the imagery in the poem. It's really a great example of her yin spirit, of the yin spirit of the female principle. And there's a way in which, as we translated the poem, I said to Rebecca, you know, this is a poem that's not just sort of ordinary. I have the feeling, because of the imagery, that she is talking about enjoying her, fully enjoying her own woman's sexuality and sensuality. Possibly even a self-pleasuring poem, though there's no way to know that. My original home is in the clouds over Wu Mountain, where I often hear the mountain's flowing spring waters, a tune that rises out of my jade harp and orbits through space, like the age-old music I hear in my dreams. The three gorges that twist and turn for thousands of miles drift into my secluded chamber in an instant. Cliffs and boulders collapse beneath my fingers. Rushing waterfalls and crashing waves come alive from the strings of my harp. Is it a raging wind holding back thunder, or the low moan of a river that cannot flow? Soon the strength of the roiling current will come to an end and return to the peaceful trickle of water dripping on flat sand. I recall the ancient times when Lord Ruan played this song and Zhongrong just couldn't hear it enough. After playing this piece one time, I will play it again. May the music flow on like a never-ending spring. When I read this tune rises out of my jade harp. Jade is not just a color, it's not just a stone. Jade also means kind of precious and beautiful. And asking and saying, cliffs and boulders collapse beneath my fingers, rushing waterfalls and crashing waves come alive from the strings of my harp. Is it a raging wind holding back thunder, or the low moan of a river that cannot flow? I said to Rebecca, this is a deeply sexual poem, and she said, I think it is. So I really love that poem. I think Lie really hit it with that. I'm a little worried about time, so I'm only going to read two more. This is a poem clearly from someone who is experienced in relationships. It's called Eight Extremes. Nearest or farthest are east and west. Deepest or shallowest is a clear stream. Highest and brightest are the sun and the moon. Most intimate or distant is a couple in bed. So this is her really letting us know some things she found out being in multiple relationships. This is a poem that talks about peach buds basically on a tree, and they're well-known symbols of youth in Chinese poetry, and also liveliness and longevity in Chinese culture. But Daoist culture considers them symbols of female desire. This poem ends with a very surprising last line. Above the railing of 100-foot well, peach branches have already budded red. Thinking of you far off by the harsh northern sea tosses me in the direction of intriguing men. So she's not just moaning, oh no, he left. She's going out there to enjoy her life, free-spirited that she could. And it's indicative of some of the things I talk about. This is the last poem I'll read of her. This is This is called After Receiving the Imperial Summons, Farewell to My Old Friends in Guanglin. And when I read the first image of this poem, it actually shocked me. I thought it was one of the best images of aging that I had ever read by anybody at any time. And this is when she had to leave her hermitage and go serve the fragrant grasses at the palace for the emperor. So this is 1 year before she was executed. Untalented and sickly, I ring the dragon bell of age. I want to do it again because that's the image. Untalented and sickly, I ring the dragon bell of age. Yet my hollow, undeserving name has reached the emperor. Glancing up, I humbly place my ceremonial headpiece over my graying hair and with regret wipe the mirror clear to fix my fading complexion. Here, my mind darts through the northern palace gate, following the fragrant grasses, eyes scanning the southern mountains to gaze at the ancient peaks. The cinnamon trees cannot keep this wild guest from leaving. Sand gulls take off freely from their shallow banks to meet in the sky. And sand gulls are white, and it's part of a Daoist legend that immortals live on mountainous islands where all of the animals and birds are white. So when she says, basically nothing can keep this wild guest from leaving, sand gulls take off freely from their shallow banks to meet in the sky, she has some sense of joining the immortals. Next poet is Xue Tao. Xue Tao was arguably, as I said, one of the most celebrated female poets of the whole Tang Dynastic period. And she was so well celebrated that even to this day, the well where she drew water for herself and for her family is visited by many people. She also was someone who made artisanal red paper, and she often wrote her poems on this red paper. And to this day in China, this red paper is called Xue Tao paper. It's very, very interesting how highly regarded that she was. One day when Xue Tao was a child, she was talking with her father, as Li did as well. And her father started a poem just spontaneously. And he said, "An ancient parasol in our courtyard, its upright trunk punctures the clouds." It's a very young image, right? An ancient parasol in our courtyard, its upright trunk punctures the clouds. And it said that without a moment's hesitation, Xue Tao completed her father's poem and said, "Her branches welcome birds from the north and the south. Her leaves mingle back and forth with the wind." The exchange, it is said, in the history of Xue Tao really made her father feeling quite anxious. And we wondered, was it her awareness of receptivity at such a young age, which is associated with yin? First, he has the parasol tree puncturing the clouds, and she says, "Well, everybody is welcome here. All the birds can come from the north and the south." There's no way to know exactly what happened, but even though she came from a good family, at some point, Xue Tao shows up as a courtesan, which was a caste that was highly marginalized in China. A courtesan, it's such a nice word, but really it means that she was in the entertainment class, which included being a sex worker. And no one knows exactly why that happened or how that happened. She had multiple relationships, including with Yu Xuanji, who was the seminal poet during the Tang Dynasty, and he also even became prime minister. And at some point, Xue Tao sort of left all that behind and entered her own hermitage, her own home at Flower Rinsing Creek. Let's see if I can. I love this poem very much. It's so pure, and it shows the quality of her mind. Listening to a Buddhist monk play reed flute, the soft cry of morning cicadas, the sorrow of evening warblers flow from your fingertips like gentle speech. You set aside reading scriptures to trouble yourself with a tune, improvising to the sound of temple chimes. It's just like the purity of autumn. For her to hear that is for her to have a mind that's like the purity of autumn. At least that's how I understand it. I'm watching the clock a little here. So let me go to this one. I'm sorry to jump around like this. This is a really important poem. It's called Hawk Soaring Away. And she had a relationship with Yuan Jin, which I mentioned, who was a seminal writer and prime minister. And at some point, things went bad in that relationship, and he rejected her and pushed her away. She then wrote what are called the 10 parting poems, in which she compared herself to collectible objects and different animals. And it's as a way of expressing her feelings about it. But when we really looked at this poem, because we were horrified that any woman, much less a woman like Xue Tao, one of the most celebrated women poets in China, would compare herself to collectible objects. When we really looked at it, we realized that she may very well have been using this poem to critique the very misogyny that she was subject to. It's a very short poem. With my talon spears and bell-like eyes, my capturing of hares, so rabbits, right? With my talon spears and bell-like eyes, my capturing of hares is praised by all. But since I soared above the blue clouds for no reason, you no longer let me perch on your arm. Since I soared away above the blue clouds for no reason you could understand. In other words, since I soared away and went where my mind wanted to go, where my imagination wanted to go, you have punished me, and you no longer let me perch on your arm. We really do see this not as saying, oh, I'm sorry, but as saying quite the opposite, as a critique, as I said, of the culture at the time in relationship to women. Again, because of time, I'm going to skip. This is another poem. This is called To Zheng Mei Jiao. And there's a character in it, Luo Fu. Luo Fu was a commoner of the 2nd century in the Common Era. And some of her poetry was known, and she came to symbolize intelligence and faithfulness and beauty and the internal world that I talked about. I see this poem as an anti-war poem, as a very early anti-war poem. Rain darkens Eyebrow Mountain, where torrential rivers flow. Standing at a distance, a woman on a high tower hides behind her sleeves. With double banners, thousands of riders gallop in formation along the eastern road. Only the immaculate beauty, Luo Fu, gazes at them from above. And the last poem I will read of Xue Tao is Sending an Old Style Poem to Wei Qi. And the red paper that I mentioned is mentioned in this poem. This poem has a startling, heartfelt confession at the end. And it's about the intimacy of their relationship. Everyone knows your writing, music, and way, but only I know the fine wind and light of your being. While describing flowers on a moonlit night, we were tender in the peaceful dark. On rainy mornings, we chanted beside each other about willows that leaned so close. For so long I was taught to hide myself like precious emerald jade, but I always wrote on red paper that you would carry by your side. Now that I'm old, not able to get things done, let me confess only to you, I wish I had been able to have raised a son. I find that extraordinarily touching poem. The last poet from our book that I'll introduce is Yu Xuanji. Just I have to find her. Yu Xuanji was born of commoner parents. And at this time, among the aristocracy, there were arranged marriages. And the arranged marriages could only happen between families and people of the same caste or the same class. Yu Xuanji, coming from a commoner class, fell in love with Li Xian when she was 15 years old, and he was from an aristocratic class. And so this did not bode well. And so she became, because he already had a primary wife, she became his second wife or lesser wife, which means that she, in some ways, became simply a paramour, simply became, a sort of sexual partner, sadly. Often at the time, the primary wives, the wives of the arranged marriages did not get the affection that they hoped for. But Li Qian and Yu Xuanji had a really passionate relationship. And so she was treated quite badly and beaten, which was not uncommon for lesser wives at this time period. At the time, it was legal to beat a lesser wife, or even to the point of disfigurement and sometimes to death. She enjoyed herself, however. At the age of 17, they split up, and she became a Daoist priestess, a very serious Daoist priestess, and she enjoyed her autonomy. She enjoyed being with herself and by herself. And this first poem is called Poem for Hermit Fog Pavilion. And it's a poem in which she just loves being close to the goddesses and following her Taoist practice. Spring flowers and autumn moons enter my poems. I live beneath the white sun and pure clear nights, free as an immortal. With my pearl drop screen still unrolled, I simply move my bed to sleep facing the mountain peaks. This is a poem that's purely Taoist. It ends with an image of a wild duck flying alone. The mandarin ducks were known to stay together for life in pairs. Flexible, without its own form, water settles into what holds it. Clouds arise from no mind, but they are willing to return. Spring winds spread melancholy over the river as the sun descends. Separated from her companions, a wild duck flies alone. This is a poem that shows her saucy, spirited nature and how happy she was to just sort of play at love when she wanted to. Though we live in the same lane, year after year, our paths don't cross. Casual conversation may soften an older woman, while fragrant osmanthus bends the fresh boughs. But the Tao's essence dupes both ice and snow, and Zen mind just laughs at finery and silk. Although traces of you have climbed clear to the Milky Way, there's still no pathway to me through the mist and the waves. Here's another poem of her enjoying the fully embodied being as a woman that she is. Free and at ease, it's called Embodied. Free and at ease, with my body peaceful and calm, I flow through this landscape alone. When the moon breaks through the scattering clouds and floats in the river, I untie my boat and drift out to sea. I will play my harp in Emperor Wu's temple and recite my poem at Marquess Yu's estate. Bamboos in a grove might be my companions, and bits of pebble can make really good friends. Let the finches squabble for position in vain. Gold and silver hold no interest for me. I fill my wine cup with the greenness of spring, plucking songs of seclusion for the moonlit night. Surrounding my stone walkway is a pure, quiet pond. I remove my hairpin to reflect its delicate streams. Lying in bed with my books all around me, I get up half drunk and run a comb through my hair. Let's see. I will go to, I think I'll read two more because the time is really moving quickly. Oh yes, I mentioned the inequality of the sexes. In order to advance in to Tang society, there was an exam that had to be taken. And if you did well in the exam, really well in the exam, it could help you to enter the aristocratic classes. It helped you get a job, a bureaucratic job. Wang Wei had that. But this exam, even though it's in poetry, was forbidden to women. Only males could take the exam. And so Yu Xuanji wrote a poem expressing her real feeling about this, just how much she needed that exam and the benefit it would have brought to her life and what it meant to her that she couldn't take it. There's the image here of clear, brutal hooks. Those brutal hooks are the characters that were written by the male poets taking the exam, but also the brutal hooks of the culture. Cloud peaks fill my eyes, banishing the light of spring. Clear, brutal hooks form beneath their fingers. I hate that my poems must hide beneath my woman's robes. I lift my head in vain and envy the names of their honorees. And I think the last poem I'll read is, it's a very interesting poem. It starts with the first verse of suffering, and then she must have had some kind of breakthrough in her meditations and entered a different place. How unbearable, rummaging for poems to read aloud beneath my lamp on this long sleepless night with my bedding so frightfully cold. A bitter wind rises in my courtyard filled with twigs and leaves. I peek through the silk curtains and pity the sinking moon. Relaxed now, without restraint, my hopes have finally been fulfilled. Whether at its peak or in decline, in the emptiness, I see original mind. Living in seclusion, I don't just nest in the phoenix's tree. As the sun goes down, chirping sparrows circle the woods in vain. So I had to skip quite a few, but thank you so much for allowing me to read some of these poems to you. Kodo.
Peter, thank you so much. What an incredible introduction to that book. And I feel like I've got a wonderful gift to give many people to come. And of course, I can't wait to read it myself. Do you want to tell us at all about your upcoming projects, or is it a secret?
Yeah, just, no, it says, no. Idea of a poetry secret. No. Rebecca and I have started translating a book that we're calling the Chan Master Poems. These are poems we're going to cover 1,000-year period from before Bodhidharma all the way into the 20th century by masters of Chan, which is the Chinese word for Zen, Buddhism. And we've already translated, I think, as of last week, 23. We'll have 100-something poems, so we're really excited about this because almost none of this work by these Chan masters, as far as we know, is known. I mean, some of it must be known. We just haven't gotten there yet. But this is a very exciting project for us, so we're working on it. We'll
Oh,
take sure.
fantastic, fantastic. Thank you so much, Peter. Wow, and extremely inspiring with, please get that book, Yin Mountain, the Immortal Poetry of Three Taoist Women. Yes, yes,
They did
yes,
such
perfect.
a beautiful job with this book. I'm so grateful.
And we're so grateful for you. Thank you. And we'll end with the four great Bodhisattva vows.
Thank you.